Hey night traveler, welcome to the Stealth Podcast. Here, you'll hear chilling stories to help you drift to sleep or keep you awake. Before we start, drop a comment telling me what time you're tuning in and where you're listening from. Now, kill the lights, put your headphones on, and let's hit the road. My name is Vernon Halstead. I'm 47 years old, and I live in Burlington, Vermont. I've been doing the van thing for about 3 years now, ever since my divorce finalized and I realized I had more freedom than I knew what to do with. My rig is a 2015 Ford Transit that I converted myself. Nothing fancy, just a bed platform, some storage, a small propane stove, and enough solar panels to keep my phone charged. I work remotely as a freelance data analyst, which means I can park anywhere with decent cell service and call it my office. My ex-wife, Diane, used to say I was running from something. Maybe she was right, but I prefer to think I'm running towards something instead. The road's been good to me, mostly. I've made friends at campgrounds, met other solo travelers, and learned that you don't need much to be content. But this story isn't about contentment. This is about what happened when I decided to push deeper into the Maine wilderness than I ever should have. I'd been working my way through New England that October, chasing the last of the fall colors before winter made van life a serious challenge. I'd spent a few nights in the White Mountains, then drifted into Maine with loose plans to hit Acadia before heading south. But I got sidetracked by this online forum where van lifers share hidden camping spots. You know, the places where you won't get hassled by rangers or have RVs rumbling past you all night. Someone posted coordinates for a logging road outside Millinocket, deep in the woods near Baxter State Park. The description was perfect: isolated, scenic, free, and far enough off the main road that you'd have total privacy. The guy who posted it, username TrailGhost88, said he'd spent 4 nights there without seeing another soul. That should have been my first clue, honestly. When someone brags about a spot being that isolated, maybe there's a reason locals avoid it. But I was feeling adventurous, and the thought of watching the northern lights from a place with zero light pollution sounded too good to pass up. The drive out there took longer than I expected. I left the main highway around 3 p.m., followed a 2-lane road through Millinocket, then turned onto a gravel path that got narrower with each passing mile. My GPS signal died about 20 minutes in, but I downloaded the offline map coordinates, so I kept going. The forest pressed in on both sides, thick stands of pine and birch that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. Every so often I'd pass an old logging marker or a rusted-out piece of equipment half swallowed by moss and ferns. The road was rutted and rough, forcing me to crawl along at maybe 10 miles per hour. I started second-guessing the whole thing when I scraped my undercarriage on a rock, but then the path opened into a small clearing, just like TrailGhost88 had described. It was perfect, almost too perfect. A roughly circular space, maybe 50 feet across, ringed by towering pines, with a fire pit made of stacked stones right in the center. Someone had left a few logs nearby, dried out and ready to burn. I pulled in, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute, listening to the silence. That silence was the first thing that felt off, though I didn't realize it then. I've camped in plenty of remote spots, and there's always some kind of ambient noise: birds, insects, wind rustling through leaves, maybe a stream bubbling somewhere nearby. But this place was dead quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the weird feeling and got out to stretch my legs and scout the area. The clearing was surrounded by dense underbrush and fallen logs, making it impossible to see more than 20 or 30 feet into the woods in any direction. I walked the perimeter, checking for trash or signs of recent visitors. The fire pit had cold ashes in it, but they could have been months old for all I knew. No footprints, no tire tracks except my own, no beer cans or cigarette butts. It was like I'd stumbled onto a place that time forgot. I sent a quick text to my buddy Marcus, just a "made it to the spot, looks great" kind of message, and noticed I had 1 bar of service. Better than nothing. By the time I finished setting up my camp chair and getting the stove ready for dinner, the sun was sinking below the tree line, and the temperature was dropping fast. I made myself a simple meal: canned chili heated over the propane burner, some crackers, a beer from my cooler, and ate while watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The stars started coming out, more than I'd seen in months, and for a while I felt that familiar peace that comes with being completely alone in nature. I'm not a religious guy, but there's something almost spiritual about sitting under a sky like that, feeling small in the best possible way. Around 8 p.m., I built a fire using the logs someone had left behind. The wood caught easily, crackling and popping as the flames grew. I sat close to it, feeding in sticks and watching sparks spiral up into the darkness. That's when I noticed the silence again. Even with the fire going, even with me moving around and making noise, the forest stayed quiet. No owls hooting, no branches snapping from deer or other animals moving through the underbrush. Nothing. I told myself it was just the cold keeping the wildlife tucked away, but part of me knew that didn't make sense. Animals don't just vanish because it's chilly. Still, I wasn't about to let a little weirdness ruin my night. I pulled out my Kindle and read for a while, occasionally glancing up at the fire or the stars, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that something about this place wasn't right. Around 10:30 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cold was starting to seep through my jacket. I kicked dirt over the coals, grabbed my flashlight, and headed back to the van. I locked the doors, something I don't always do when I'm camping in the middle of nowhere, but tonight it felt necessary, and climbed into my sleeping bag. My van has blackout curtains over all the windows, so once I was settled in, it was pitch dark inside. I lay there for a while, listening to the quiet and waiting for sleep to come. That's when I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Knock, knock, knock. Right on the side of my van, maybe 5 feet from where my head was resting. My whole body went rigid. My first thought was that someone had followed me out here, maybe another Vanlifer looking for the same spot. But that didn't make sense. I would have heard an engine, seen headlights. And who knocks on a stranger's van at nearly 11 p.m. in the middle of the woods? I waited, holding my breath, listening for footsteps or voices. Nothing. Just that awful, suffocating silence pressing in from all sides. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, 3 more knocks. Same rhythm, same spot. Knock, knock, knock. This time I could feel the vibration through the van's metal frame. Whatever was out there, it was real. I didn't move. I just laid there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the darkness where I knew the van's ceiling was, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The knocks had stopped, but somehow that made it worse. If it was a person, they would have said something by now, right? Called out, asked if I was okay, made some kind of human noise. But there was nothing. Just that same dead silence that had been bothering me since I arrived. I reached slowly for my phone on the little shelf near my head, trying not to make any sound, like whatever was outside might hear me and know I was awake. My fingers found it, and I turned it on, squinting against the sudden brightness. No service. The single bar I'd had earlier was gone. Of course it was. I pulled up my flashlight app, but didn't turn it on yet. Part of me didn't want to look outside, didn't want to pull back those curtains and see what might be standing there in the dark. The smart thing would have been to stay put, wait until morning, pretend it was just a branch falling or some animal bumping into the van. But I've never been great at taking the smart route. I sat up slowly, the sleeping bag rustling louder than I wanted in the quiet. I stayed like that for a minute, just listening, trying to hear anything that might tell me what I was dealing with. Still nothing. No breathing, no footsteps, no sound of something moving through the brush. It was like the whole forest had died the moment those knocks stopped. I crawled forward toward the driver's seat, moving as quietly as I could, and reached for the curtain that covered the windshield. My hand was shaking. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I was scared in a way I hadn't been since I was a kid afraid of the dark. There's something primal about being alone in the wilderness when something goes wrong, when your brain starts screaming that you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. I pulled the curtain back just a crack, maybe an inch, and peered out into the clearing. The embers from my fire were still glowing faintly, casting just enough red light to see maybe 20 feet in front of the van. Beyond that, it was pure darkness. No moon tonight, no stars visible through the canopy overhead, and no person, no animal, nothing. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and pulled the curtain open a little wider. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it. My camp chair sitting near the dead fire, the circle of stones, the wall of trees pressing in from all sides. I scanned every shadow, every dark space between the pines, looking for movement or shapes that didn't belong. Nothing. My logical brain started working overtime, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe it was a branch that had fallen against the van. Maybe it was the metal contracting from the cold and making noise. Maybe I'd been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd heard. Those weren't random sounds. They were knocks. Deliberate. Purposeful. 3 of them. Twice. In the exact same spot. I grabbed my real flashlight from the cup holder and clicked it on, aiming the beam through the windshield and sweeping it across the clearing. The light cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the trees and underbrush in harsh white detail. Still nothing. No eyes reflecting back at me, no figure ducking behind a tree, no footprints in the dirt around my van. That's when I made my first mistake. I unlocked the driver's door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cold night air with my flashlight held out in front of me like a weapon. The temperature had dropped even more since I'd gone to bed, probably down in the 30s now, and my breath came out in visible clouds. I walked around to the side of the van where I'd heard the knocks, shining my light on the metal panel. No dents, no scratches, no marks of any kind. I crouched down and examined the ground. The dirt was hard-packed and covered with a thin layer of pine needles, not great for showing tracks, but I should have been able to see something if a person or large animal had been standing there. Nothing. Not a single footprint, not a disturbed patch of ground, not even a bent blade of grass. It was like whatever had knocked on my van had been floating in the air. I stood up and swept my flashlight in a slow circle, checking the entire perimeter of the clearing. The beam caught on tree trunks and low-hanging branches, casting weird shadows that made my stomach clench every time I thought I saw movement. But it was just the wind, except there wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. I called out, my voice sounding small and stupid in the vast darkness. "Hello? Anyone out there?" The words seemed to get swallowed by the trees, like the forest was absorbing the sound before it could travel. No echo, no response. I tried again, louder this time. "If someone's messing with me, it's not funny. Just come out and we can talk." Still nothing. I was starting to feel ridiculous, standing there in my thermal shirt and sweatpants, yelling at trees in the middle of the night. But I was also starting to feel something else, a creeping sense that I was being watched. You know that feeling, right? When the hair on the back of your neck stands up and your body knows something's wrong, even if your brain hasn't caught up yet. I had that in spades. I backed toward the van slowly, keeping my flashlight moving, not wanting to turn my back on the woods. Every shadow looked threatening now. Every dark space between the trees could have been hiding something. I climbed back into the driver's seat and locked the door behind me, then checked all the other doors to make sure they were locked too. My hands were still shaking. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, maybe an hour, just watching the clearing through the windshield and listening. The silence was absolute, oppressive, like someone had wrapped the whole world in cotton. I kept expecting to hear something. An owl, a coyote, even just the wind picking up, but there was nothing. Around midnight, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I'd heard some weird noises, couldn't find an explanation, and my brain had filled in the blanks with scary possibilities. That's what brains do when you're alone in the dark. They make monsters out of shadows. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, determined to get some sleep. Tomorrow I'd laugh about this whole thing, maybe post about it on the Vanlife forum with a spooky night in main subject line. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept drifting in and out, half dreaming about someone standing outside my van, just beyond where my flashlight could reach. And then, at 2:47 a.m. according to my phone, the knocks came again. Same spot, same rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. But this time they were louder, more insistent, like whatever was out there was getting impatient. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, pulled on my boots without even lacing them, and threw open the side door of the van. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe that confronting whatever this was would make it stop. Or maybe I was just so tired and frustrated that fear had given way to anger. I jumped out into the clearing, my flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness as I spun around. "Who's there?" I shouted, not caring anymore if I sounded scared or crazy. "Show yourself." My voice echoed back at me this time, but only faintly, like even the sound waves didn't want to stay in this place too long. I walked around the van again, checking the exact spot where the knocks had come from. Still nothing. No tracks, no marks, no evidence that anything had touched my vehicle. I kicked at the ground in frustration, sending pine needles scattering, and that's when my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. About 30 feet into the tree line, just barely visible through the underbrush, there were shapes. Not trees. These were too uniform, too vertical. I moved closer, my boots crunching on the frozen ground, and the shapes resolved into something that didn't make any sense. Wooden posts, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, driven into the earth in a rough circle. They were old, weathered gray by years of exposure, and carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Not words exactly, more like geometric patterns, circles intersecting with lines, triangles within squares, things that looked almost like crude faces. My first thought was that this was some kind of historical marker, maybe something left by loggers decades ago. But the more I looked at it, the less sense that made. The posts were arranged too deliberately, and the symbols were too intricate to be random scratches. This was intentional. Someone had built this thing, and recently enough that the posts hadn't rotted away completely. I raised my phone to take a picture, but of course there was still no service, and the camera app wouldn't even open without freezing. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the van, start the engine, and drive out of there even if it meant navigating that rutted logging road in the dark. But curiosity is a hell of a drug, and I've always had too much of it for my own good. I walked closer to the circle of posts, ducking under low branches and pushing through scratchy underbrush. The posts were spaced maybe 6 feet apart, forming a perimeter around an area of ground that looked disturbed. Not freshly dug, but like something had been buried there a long time ago and the earth had never quite settled right. The dirt was darker in the center, almost black, and there was a smell I couldn't quite place. Not rot exactly, but something organic and wrong, like mushrooms left too long in a wet basement. I stepped between 2 of the posts, into the circle, and immediately felt dizzy. The ground seemed to tilt under my feet, even though I knew it was level, and that oppressive silence got even heavier, like someone had turned up the volume on nothing. I stumbled backward out of the circle, my heart racing again, and nearly tripped over a root. The dizziness passed as soon as I crossed back outside the posts, but the wrongness of it stayed with me. I've been in some weird places during my years on the road. Abandoned buildings, forgotten graveyards, stretches of desert where people had died and left their cars to rust, but I'd never felt anything like this. It was like the air inside that circle was thicker, heavier, like it belonged to a different place entirely. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the posts, half expecting them to move or change somehow. They didn't, of course. They just stood there, silent and ancient and completely out of place in this main forest. When I got back to my van, I slammed the door and locked it, then sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and the heat blasting. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I should have left. I know that now, but leaving meant navigating that dark, narrow logging road for miles, and I was scared I'd end up stuck or crashed in a ditch somewhere even worse than here. So I made my second mistake. I stayed. I told myself I'd wait until first light, just a few more hours, and then I'd get out of there and never come back. I turned off the engine to save gas and climbed into the back, triple checking that all the doors were locked and all the curtains were pulled tight. I got back into my sleeping bag fully clothed this time, boots and all, and lay there staring at the dark ceiling. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Those posts had to be old, maybe Native American or some early settler thing, though I'd never heard of anything like that in Maine. Or maybe it was something more recent, some kind of art project or pagan ritual site that local kids used. That would explain why Trail Ghost 88 had posted the coordinates online. Maybe the whole thing was a setup, a way to scare Vanlifers for kicks. But that didn't explain the knocks, or the lack of footprints, or the way I'd felt inside that circle. I checked my phone again. 3:15 a.m. Still no service. The battery was down to 40%. I put it on airplane mode to save power and closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the roof of my van. Not footsteps. It was too smooth for that, too continuous. It sounded like someone was pulling a heavy branch or maybe a tarp across the metal, slowly, deliberately, from the front of the van toward the back. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, tracking the sound as it moved overhead. It reached the back doors and stopped. Then, after maybe 10 seconds of silence, it started again, moving from back to front this time. My rational brain tried to tell me it was a branch that had fallen and was being blown around by wind, but there was no wind. I could tell from the way the van sat perfectly still, no rocking or swaying. Whatever was up there, it was moving on its own. The dragging sound made 3 complete passes, front to back to front to back, and then stopped. I waited for what came next, my whole body tense, expecting knocks or voices or something worse. Instead, I heard footsteps. Not on the roof anymore, but on the ground outside, circling the van. Slow, heavy footsteps, deliberate as a funeral march. The footsteps circled the van 3 times, and I counted every single one of them. 22 steps to complete the circle. I know because I was gripping my phone so hard my knuckles had gone white, and I counted each footfall like it might somehow give me control over the situation. The steps were heavy, deliberate, and they crunched on the frozen ground with a weight that suggested something big. A person, maybe, or a large animal like a bear or moose. But bears don't walk in perfect circles, and moose don't knock on vans with that kind of rhythm. After the 3rd circuit, the footsteps stopped right outside the driver's door. I could hear breathing now, deep, slow breaths that seemed to rattle in whatever chest they were coming from. Not human breathing. It was too measured, too controlled, like something was purposely letting me know it was there. I wanted to scream, to start the engine and just gun it out of there regardless of what I might hit. But I was frozen. Literally couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up with fear. Then came a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. Scratching. Long, dragging scratches against the driver's side window, like fingernails on glass, but deeper, more resonant. 3 scratches, slow and deliberate, top to bottom. I could hear the squeak of whatever was making contact with the glass, could imagine the marks being left behind. My mind conjured up images of claws, of something inhuman pressing its hand against my window and dragging down. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. Then a voice. Vernon. Just my name, spoken in a whisper that somehow carried through the metal walls of the van like they weren't even there. It wasn't a man's voice or a woman's voice. It was somewhere in between, raspy and wet, like someone speaking through a mouthful of water. Vernon, open the door. I felt my bladder nearly let go. Nobody out here knew my name. Nobody. I hadn't told anyone where I was going except Marcus, and he was back in Vermont. This thing, whatever it was, shouldn't have known who I was. I forced myself to move, crawling backward away from the driver's seat toward the rear of the van, my sleeping bag tangling around my legs. I fumbled for my flashlight, but couldn't find it in the dark. My phone was still in my hand, and I turned on its flashlight, aiming it at the curtain covering the driver's window. I could see the fabric moving slightly, like something was pressing against the glass from outside, making it bow inward. Vernon, the voice came again, more insistent this time. We've been waiting. Open the door. We. It said we. That meant more than one. I pressed myself against the back doors of the van, as far from that voice as I could get, and tried to think. My keys were in the cup holder up front. To start the van and drive out of here, I'd have to go back toward that window, toward that voice. But staying here wasn't an option either. Whatever was outside, it knew my name, and it wanted in. I made a decision born of pure panic. I'd go out the back doors instead, run into the woods, hide until daylight, then circle back for the van. Terrible plan, I know that now. But fear makes you stupid, makes you think you can outrun things that have home field advantage. I slowly unlocked the back doors, trying to keep the clicking sound as quiet as possible. The voice outside had gone silent, and I didn't know if that was better or worse. Maybe it had left. Maybe it was waiting. I pushed one door open just a crack, cold air rushing in, and peered out into the darkness. The clearing behind my van looked empty, the dead fire pit barely visible in the faint glow from my phone's light. I couldn't see into the tree line, couldn't see what might be hiding there waiting for me. But I also couldn't stay in the van with that thing outside the driver's door. I pushed the door open wider and climbed out, my boots hitting the frozen ground with a soft thump. The cold hit me immediately. It had to be in the 20s now, and I was just wearing a thermal shirt and jeans. I closed the door quietly behind me and started backing toward the tree line, keeping my phone's light pointed at the van, watching for movement around the sides. That's when I saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line, maybe 15 feet away. I couldn't tell how many at first. The darkness and the trees made them blend together, but as my eyes adjusted I counted 5, maybe 6. They were tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, and they didn't move like people. They swayed slightly, like trees in a breeze, even though the air was still. I couldn't make out features, just dark shapes that were somehow darker than the shadows around them. My phone's light didn't seem to reach them properly, like the beam was being absorbed before it could illuminate anything useful. I stood there frozen, my breath coming in short gasps that formed clouds in the freezing air. One of the figures took a step forward, and I could hear that same heavy footstep I'd heard circling the van. Then another figure moved, and another, all of them advancing slowly toward me in a coordinated way that suggested they were hurting me. I stumbled backward, and my heel caught on something, a rock or a root, and I went down hard on my back. The fall knocked the wind out of me, and my phone went flying, landing face down in the dirt a few feet away. The light was still on, creating a small pool of illumination that didn't reach me anymore. I scrambled to my hands and knees, trying to get to the phone, and that's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Not grabbing, just resting there, impossibly heavy and cold even through my shirt. The cold spread from that point of contact down my arm and across my chest, like ice water flowing through my veins. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could barely breathe. The hand stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and then it was gone. I lurched forward, grabbed my phone, and spun around expecting to see one of those figures standing over me. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The figures were gone. The van sat there silent and dark, no movement around it, no sounds at all. I ran back to it and yanked open the driver's door, throwing myself inside and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition, but I managed it, and the engine roared to life. I didn't even let the engine warm up. I threw the van into gear and started driving, my headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the narrow logging road ahead. The van bounced and scraped over rocks and ruts, and I didn't care. I just needed to get out of that clearing, away from those things, back to civilization where things made sense. My shoulders still felt cold where that hand had touched me, a lingering numbness that spread down to my fingertips. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to will warmth back into my arm, and focused on navigating the treacherous road. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches reaching overhead and blocking out what little starlight might have filtered through. My headlights were the only source of illumination, and they seemed weaker than they should have been, like the darkness out here was thicker somehow, harder to penetrate. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes, following the twists and turns of the logging road, expecting any moment to reach the main gravel path that would lead me back to the paved highway. But I never reached it. Instead, after that 20 minutes of driving, my headlights illuminated something that made my stomach drop. The clearing. My clearing. The stone fire pit. The logs I'd left stacked nearby. The exact spot where I'd parked hours ago. I slammed on the brakes, and the van skidded to a stop, dirt and pine needles spraying out from under the tires. This wasn't possible. I'd been driving in a straight line, following the only road out. I couldn't have gotten turned around. There were no intersections, no forks in the path. Just one road in, one road out. But here I was, back where I started. I checked my mirrors, looking behind me at the road I'd just traveled. It stretched back into darkness, looking exactly like it had when I drove in earlier that evening. I put the van in reverse and started backing up, thinking maybe I'd missed a turn somehow. I went maybe 100 yards, my backup camera showing nothing but trees and dirt road, then stopped and put it back in drive. Went forward again, following the road, keeping my speed slow so I wouldn't miss anything. 10 minutes later, I was back in the clearing again. Panic was setting in now, real deep panic that made my chest tight and my vision blur at the edges. I was going in circles somehow, looping back to this cursed spot no matter which direction I drove. I grabbed my phone to check the GPS, even though I knew there was no service. The screen showed my location as a blank area. No roads marked, no landmarks, just a blue dot sitting in the middle of nothing. I tried to zoom out to see if I could at least figure out which direction was which, but the map wouldn't load. Just kept spinning that little loading circle that never resolved into anything useful. I threw the phone down on the passenger seat and put my head in my hands, trying to think clearly through the fear. Those posts in the woods, the circle of carved symbols, maybe that had something to do with this. Maybe I'd crossed into something when I stepped inside that circle, broken some kind of boundary. It sounded insane, even in my own head, but nothing else made sense. I'd never believed in supernatural stuff before. Ghosts, demons, curses, all that was just stories people told to scare each other. But something was happening here that couldn't be explained by bad navigation or coincidence. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time, engine idling, trying to figure out what to do. Going back out there on foot was suicide. Those things had almost grabbed me, or did grab me, or whatever the hell that hand on my shoulder had been. But staying in the van and waiting for morning didn't feel much safer. What if morning never came? What if I was stuck in some kind of loop, driving the same stretch of road over and over while those things waited in the darkness? I thought about Marcus, about how he'd wonder where I was when I didn't check in tomorrow. He'd probably call eventually, and when I didn't answer, he'd maybe contact the authorities, tell them my last known location. But I'd only send him a vague text about being in Maine. He didn't have coordinates, didn't know about this specific clearing. Nobody did except Trail Ghost 88, whoever that was. For all I knew, Trail Ghost 88 was part of this somehow. Someone who lured Vanlifers to this spot for reasons I didn't want to think about. I pulled out my phone again and opened the forum app, thinking maybe I could leave a warning post for anyone else who might consider coming here. The app opened, and I was shocked to see I had signal. Just one bar, but enough to load the page. I started typing frantically, my thumb stabbing at the screen. Do not go to the Millinocket coordinates Trail Ghost 88 posted. Something wrong with this place. Can't leave. If someone sees this, send help. Vernon Halstead, Burlington, Vermont. I hit post and watched the little spinning icon that indicated it was uploading. It spun for maybe 10 seconds, then gave me an error message. Failed to post. No internet connection. But I had signal. I could see the bar right there at the top of the screen. I tried again. Same error. Tried to send a text to Marcus instead. Message failed. Tried to call him. The call wouldn't even connect. Just gave me a fast, busy signal and dropped. I was about to throw the phone at the windshield in frustration when it buzzed in my hand. A notification. Someone had sent me a private message on the forum. My blood went cold when I saw the username. Trail Ghost 88. I opened it with shaking hands, and the message was short. You shouldn't have stepped inside the circle, Vernon. They don't like visitors, but they love guests. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. Trail Ghost 88 knew I'd gone into the circle of posts, knew my name, knew I was trapped here, which meant Trail Ghost 88 was either watching me somehow or was part of whatever those things in the woods were. I looked out the windshield at the dark clearing, expecting to see figures emerging from the tree line again. Nothing yet, but I could feel them out there, watching, waiting. The hand on my shoulder had been a warning, or maybe a marking, a way for them to track me. I started the van moving again, driving toward the logging road, even though I knew it would just loop back here. But I had to try something, had to keep moving. As my headlights swept across the tree line, I saw them, all of them, standing in a circle around the entire clearing, dozens of those tall, dark figures, swaying in unison. They were blocking every gap between the trees, every possible escape route. And as I watched, they all took one step forward together, then another, slowly closing the circle. I gunned the engine and drove straight at them, figuring I'd crash through the underbrush if I had to. But as I got close, my headlights seemed to pass right through them like they weren't solid, and then the van lurched to a stop. The engine died, the lights went out, and in the sudden darkness, I heard that voice again, coming from all around me now. Welcome home, Vernon. My name is Iris Kinmore. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Maine. I bought my van, a 2018 Mercedes Sprinter, 2 years ago after I quit my job as a psychiatric nurse at Maine Medical Center. Burnout doesn't even begin to describe what I was feeling back then. 12-hour shifts dealing with people in crisis, understaffed units, the constant weight of other people's trauma seeping into my bones until I couldn't tell where their pain ended and mine began. My therapist suggested I needed a complete break, a reset, and selling most of my stuff to live on the road seemed like the most extreme reset I could manage without leaving the country. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. My younger brother, Colin, was the only one who got it. He helped me convert the Sprinter, installing solar panels and a small sink, building out a bed platform with storage underneath. He's always been handy like that, good with tools and problem solving. He told me if I ever needed anything, just call. I promised I would, though we both knew I probably wouldn't. I'd been doing the van life thing pretty successfully for those 2 years, working remotely as a medical transcriptionist to pay for gas and food. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, or at least it had been until I started having the dreams. They'd started about a month ago, always the same basic structure. Me driving through a forest at night, my headlights catching glimpses of something tall moving between the trees, and then waking up with this overwhelming urge to go north. Deeper into Maine, toward the wilderness areas I'd been avoiding because they felt too isolated even for me. I'd mentioned the dreams to Colin during our last phone call, laughing them off as stress or too much coffee before bed. He'd made some joke about me turning into one of those people who thinks the universe is sending them messages. But the dreams kept getting more vivid, more insistent, until last week when I finally gave in and started driving toward Millinocket. I told myself I was just exploring, checking out Baxter State Park before the winter made it inaccessible. But deep down, I knew I was following something, being pulled toward something I didn't understand. I'd spent the previous night at a proper campground near Medway, the last bit of civilization before the really remote areas. That morning, I'd stopped at a small general store to stock up on supplies and mentioned to the clerk that I was heading up toward the logging roads near Baxter. The guy was probably in his 60s, weathered face and suspicious eyes, and he'd given me a look I couldn't quite read. "A lot of those old roads up there," he'd said slowly, "but most folks don't go past the marked trails anymore. Not for a few years now." I'd asked him why, and he'd just shrugged, going back to scanning my groceries. Animals acting weird. People hearing things. You know how it is with deep woods, they got their own reputation. I'd laughed it off at the time, paid for my stuff, and left. But his words stuck with me as I drove further north, following a route I'd found marked on an old paper map I'd bought at the store. The map showed a network of logging roads, most of them probably decades old, branching off into the forest like veins. One of them had a small pencil mark next to it, just an X, no explanation. I'd been following that road for about an hour, my Sprinter handling the rough terrain better than I'd expected, when I came across the first weird thing. A backpack hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet off the ground. Not thrown up there by accident. It was tied to the branch with rope, positioned so it was clearly visible from the road. I stopped the van and got out to look at it, standing there in the cold afternoon air with my hands in my jacket pockets. The backpack was old, faded blue, with water damage and what looked like claw marks across the front. I couldn't reach it without climbing, and something about the way it hung there made me not want to touch it anyway. There was a smell too, faint but distinct, like meat that had gone bad. I took a picture with my phone, thinking maybe I'd report it to park rangers or something, and got back in the van. As I drove away, I glanced in my side mirror and could swear I saw the backpack swaying, even though there wasn't any wind. The second weird thing happened about 20 minutes later. I came around a bend and had to slam on my brakes because there was something in the middle of the road. At first I thought it was a deer or a moose, just a dark shape blocking the path. But as I got closer I realized it was a person, standing perfectly still, facing away from me, wearing what looked like dark, tattered clothes. I honked my horn, a friendly little beep to let them know I was there. The figure didn't move. I honked again, longer this time, and rolled down my window. "Hey, you okay?" My voice sounded too loud in the quiet forest. The figure still didn't move, didn't even turn their head. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something about the way they stood there, so still, so rigid, reminded me of patients I'd seen in catatonic states at the hospital. I put the van in park and grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call for help, but of course there was no service this far out. I looked back up at the figure, and it was gone, just vanished. The road was empty, no movement in the trees, no sign anyone had been there at all. I sat there for a long minute, my heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it had been a shadow, a trick of the light through the trees. Maybe I was more tired than I realized and my brain was filling in shapes that weren't really there. That happens sometimes when you're driving through monotonous scenery. Your mind creates patterns, sees things that aren't real. I put the van back in drive and continued slowly down the road, scanning the tree line for any sign of the figure. Nothing. The forest pressed in close on both sides, thick with pine and bare deciduous trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the gray sky. Another 15 minutes of driving brought me to a clearing that looked like it had been used as a camping spot before. There was a fire pit made of stones, some flattened areas where tents or vehicles had been parked, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness that made my nursing instincts flare up. This was the kind of feeling I'd get walking into a patient's room right before they coded, that split-second awareness that something was very wrong even before the monitors started alarming. But I was exhausted, it was getting late, and the next decent camping spot might be miles away. So I pulled in, killed the engine, and made my third mistake in as many hours. I decided to stay. I got out of the van and did my usual setup routine, trying to ignore the uneasiness crawling up my spine. The clearing was maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to absorb sound. I walked the perimeter, checking for trash or signs of recent visitors, and found something that made me stop cold. Scratched into the bark of a large pine tree, about chest height, were words. Not carved cleanly with a knife, but gouged deep and jagged, like someone had used their fingernails or a rock. "They come at night," was all it said. The letters were uneven, frantic, and the bark around them was stained dark. Could have been sap, could have been something else. I reached out to touch the words, and then thought better of it. My psychiatric training kicked in, offering rational explanations. Probably just some teenagers trying to scare people, or maybe someone having a mental health crisis had wandered out here and left a warning before getting help. But the scratches looked old, weathered by at least a season or two of exposure, and the desperation in those gouged letters felt real. I stepped back from the tree and pulled out my phone to take a picture, more out of habit than anything else. Still no service, but the camera worked fine. I snapped a few shots of the message, then turned to photograph the rest of the clearing for reference. That's when I noticed the stones. Not just the fire pit. There were other stones arranged around the clearing's edge, partially hidden by fallen leaves and pine needles. I walked over to the nearest one and kicked away the debris. It was flat and smooth, about the size of a dinner plate, and it had been painted. The paint was faded and peeling, but I could still make out a symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun. I found another stone a few feet away with a different symbol, this one looking like interlocking triangles. There were at least a dozen of them forming a rough circle around the camping area. Some kind of art project maybe, or protective symbols if you believed in that sort of thing. My ex-girlfriend, Tessa, had been really into crystals and energy work. She would have probably said these were wards or totems meant to keep something out, or keep something in. I went back to my van and started my evening routine, determined not to let a few weird decorations spook me. I'd seen scarier things working night shifts in the psych ward. Patients who'd hurt themselves, people in the grip of psychotic breaks who thought demons were chasing them, the quiet ones who scared you more than the loud ones because you never knew what they were thinking. This was just a clearing in the woods with some quirky human touches, nothing supernatural about it. I heated up a can of soup on my portable stove, ate it while sitting in my camp chair watching the sky turn dark, and tried to convince myself I was having a nice, peaceful evening. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, the way your peripheral vision keeps catching movement that isn't there when you turn to look? I had that constantly. Every time I glanced toward the tree line, I half expected to see that figure from the road standing there, watching me. By 8 o'clock it was fully dark, and the temperature had dropped into the 30s. I built a small fire in the stone pit, more for psychological comfort than warmth, and sat close to it with a book I'd been trying to finish for weeks. I couldn't concentrate on the words though. The silence was wrong, just like that clerk at the store had hinted. In a healthy forest, you should hear things. Owls hunting, small animals rustling through underbrush, the wind moving through branches, maybe the distant sound of a stream. But this place was dead quiet, like someone had hit a mute button on nature. I found myself holding my breath just to hear something, anything. When I did hear a sound, it was wrong too. A snapping branch, loud and sharp, from somewhere in the trees to my left. I looked up from my book, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing visible. Another snap, closer this time. Then another from a different direction, to my right. I stood up, my heart rate picking up, and grabbed my flashlight from the chair's cup holder. I swept the beam across the tree line, and for just a second, I saw them. Eyes. Multiple pairs of eyes reflecting back at me, maybe 20 feet into the woods. But they were too high off the ground to be deer or any normal animal. These were at least 6 feet up, and they didn't blink or look away like an animal's would. They just stared, unmoving, as my flashlight beam passed over them. I counted 3 pairs, no 4, spread out in a line parallel to the clearing. My nurse brain tried to rationalize. Maybe they were camping lanterns hung in trees, or reflectors someone had placed. But I knew that wasn't right. These were eyes, and they were watching me. I backed toward my van slowly, not wanting to turn my back on those staring points of light. My hand found the door handle, and I yanked it open, practically diving inside. I slammed the door and locked it, then looked out through the windshield. The eyes were gone. Just darkness and trees, the firelight casting weird shadows that seemed to move on their own. I sat in the driver's seat breathing hard, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. This was insane. I was a rational person, a healthcare professional, someone who dealt with reality every single day. I didn't believe in monsters in the woods or supernatural threats. But something was out there, whether it was people trying to scare me or some kind of animal I wasn't familiar with, and my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I put the key in the ignition, ready to start the engine and drive out of there, but then I stopped. Where would I go? It was pitch dark, the logging road was treacherous even in daylight, and I'd probably end up stuck or crashed within a mile. Better to wait until morning, keep the doors locked, and leave at first light. I climbed into the back of the van and got into my sleeping bag, fully clothed with my boots within reach. I left one small LED light on, not wanting to be in complete darkness, and lay there listening. The silence outside was absolute, oppressive. No fire crackling anymore. It must have burned down while I was sitting in the driver's seat. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just my own breathing and the occasional creak of the van settling. I checked my phone. 9:47 p.m. No service still, battery at 68%. I set it on the small shelf near my head and closed my eyes, knowing I wouldn't sleep, but hoping I might at least rest. That's when I heard the singing. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint melody drifting through the walls of the van, so soft I thought I might be imagining it. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing something that sounded almost like a lullaby, but in a language I didn't recognize. Not French or Spanish or anything I'd heard before, just flowing syllables that rose and fell in an eerie, beautiful pattern. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear better, trying to figure out which direction it was coming from. The voice seemed to circle around the van, moving from the front to the side to the back, like whoever was singing was walking around my vehicle in slow circles. My first instinct was to look outside, to peek through the curtains and see who was out there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the voice sounded too perfect, too practiced, like a recording rather than a live person. Or maybe it was the memory of those eyes in the trees, watching without blinking. Either way, I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, listening to that disturbing melody circle around me. The singing went on for maybe 5 minutes, getting slightly louder with each pass, until I could make out individual words even though I didn't know what they meant. And then it stopped abruptly, mid-phrase, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the singing. I waited, barely breathing, for what would come next. A knock, maybe, or scratching on the windows, or that voice calling my name like it had called to others before me. But there was nothing for a long time, maybe 10 minutes of absolute quiet. Then I heard footsteps. Not walking this time, running. Something was running around my van in fast circles, feet pounding on the frozen ground, going around and around so fast I got dizzy trying to track the sound. It sounded like multiple people or things, all running in the same direction, creating a vortex of sound that made the van vibrate slightly. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, and that's when I realized I could hear other sounds underneath the running. Whispers, dozens of overlapping whispers, all saying things I couldn't quite make out. The running stopped as suddenly as it had started, and in the new silence I heard a child's voice. "Mommy? Mommy, where are you?" It was coming from right outside my back doors, small and frightened and heartbreakingly real. Every instinct I had as a former nurse, as someone who'd spent years helping people in crisis, screamed at me to open the doors and help. What if there really was a lost child out there, separated from their parents, scared and cold? But another part of me, the part that had learned to recognize manipulation from patients who weren't always honest about their intentions, knew this was a trap. No child would be out here, miles from any campground or hiking trail, in the middle of the night. And the voice, now that I was really listening, had a strange quality to it, Too clear, too projected, like someone was doing an impression of a child rather than actually being one. "Mommy, please. I'm scared." The voice was closer now, right against the doors, and I could hear something scratching at the metal. "Mommy, let me in. It's cold out here." I grabbed my phone and turned off the LED light, plunging the van into darkness. Maybe if whatever was out there thought I was asleep, it would leave me alone. The child's voice continued for another minute, becoming more desperate, more frantic. "Mommy, they're coming. Please, please let me in." Then it changed. The pitch dropped, became raspier, more adult. "Iris, I know you can hear me. Iris." My blood turned to ice. It knew my name, just like in that forum message Vernon must have gotten. I'd heard about his story on the Vanlife forums before the thread got deleted. People said he'd gone missing near Millinocket, and now I understood why. Whatever was out here, it knew things it shouldn't know, and it used that knowledge to get inside your head. "Iris Kinmore from Portland. Psychiatric nurse. Running from something, aren't you?" The voice laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bones. "We all run from something, but you can't run from us. We're everywhere in these woods. We've been here longer than the trees." I wanted to scream, to tell it to shut up and leave me alone, but I kept my mouth clamped shut. Engaging with it would only make things worse. I'd learned that from patients experiencing psychotic episodes. Don't argue with the delusion. Don't feed into it. Just stay calm and wait for it to pass. Except this wasn't a delusion. This was real, whatever it was. The voice outside went quiet again, and I heard footsteps walking away from the van, crunching through the undergrowth. I waited in the darkness, counting my breaths, trying to slow my racing heart. 1 minute passed. 2. 5. Nothing. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever game they were playing had ended, and they'd moved on to torment someone else. I was just starting to relax, just beginning to think I might survive until morning, when something hit the roof of my van with tremendous force. The whole vehicle rocked from the impact, and I heard metal groaning. Another impact, then another, like someone was dropping boulders onto the roof from high above. I scrambled toward the driver's seat, thinking I'd risk the dark roads rather than stay here and let whatever was up there cave in my roof. My fingers found the keys in the ignition, but before I could turn them, the impact stopped. The van settled back onto its suspension with a gentle bounce, and everything went quiet again. I sat there in the driver's seat, my hand on the keys, waiting. Nothing happened. No more impacts, no more voices, no more running. Just silence. I checked my phone, 1:23 a.m. I'd been dealing with this nightmare for hours, and it was still hours until dawn. I couldn't stay in the driver's seat all night, my back already aching from the tension, but I also couldn't relax enough to go back to my sleeping bag. I compromised by reclining the driver's seat as far as it would go and pulling a blanket over myself. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the van, looking for any sign of damage from those impacts. The metal looked fine, no dents or deformations visible in the faint glow from my phone screen. Which didn't make sense. Those hits had been hard enough to rock the entire vehicle. I must have dozed off eventually, exhaustion overriding fear, because the next thing I knew I was jerking awake to the sound of my phone buzzing. A notification. I grabbed it, hope flaring in my chest. Maybe I had service, maybe someone was trying to reach me. But when I looked at the screen, my hope died. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize. No area code, just a string of zeros. The message read, "Look outside, Iris. We want to show you something beautiful." My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. How was I getting texts with no service? And who, or what, was sending them? Another message came through before I could process the first one. "Don't be afraid. We just want you to see. Look through your window. Look at what we've made for you." I wanted to delete the messages, to turn off my phone and pretend they didn't exist. But a sick curiosity was growing in my gut, the same morbid fascination that used to make me read patient charts about the worst cases, the ones that would haunt me for weeks. Against every bit of common sense I had left, I reached for the curtain covering the driver's side window. I pulled the curtain back just an inch, peering out into the darkness with my phone's light off so I wouldn't be silhouetted. What I saw made my stomach lurch. The clearing wasn't empty anymore. There were things standing in a circle around my van, maybe 20 or 30 of them, all perfectly still. They looked almost human from a distance. 2 legs, 2 arms, upright posture, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at angles that shouldn't be possible. Their heads were the worst part. I couldn't make out faces in the darkness, just smooth oval shapes that caught the faint starlight and reflected it back like polished stones. They were all facing the van, all standing at exactly the same distance from it, like they'd been positioned with mathematical precision. And in the center of their circle, in the middle of the clearing where my fire pit had been, something was glowing. A soft blue-green light pulsed from the ground, illuminating the figures from below and casting long shadows that stretched toward my van like reaching fingers. I let the curtain fall back and pressed myself against the driver's seat, my breathing coming in short gasps. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of hallucination, a psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. I'd seen patients have breaks like this, suddenly convinced they were being watched or followed, seeing things that weren't there, losing touch with consensus reality. Maybe I'd been more damaged by my years in the psych ward than I'd realized. Maybe the van life hadn't been healing me, just giving me space to fall apart without witnesses. My phone buzzed again. Another message from those zeros. You see them now. They've been waiting for you, Iris. They wait for everyone who comes here. The forest chose this place a long time ago. I wanted to throw the phone across the van, but instead I found myself typing a response with trembling fingers. What do you want? The reply came instantly. We are what remains. We want what we've always wanted. To not be alone. That response chilled me more than any threat could have. There was something desperately sad about it, something that reminded me of patients in the isolation rooms. People so lost in their own minds that they couldn't connect with reality anymore, but still craved human contact. I typed again. Let me leave and I won't tell anyone about this place. 3 dots appeared, showing that something was typing. Then, you can't leave. No one leaves once they've been marked. Vernon didn't leave. The others didn't leave. You won't leave either. But don't worry, Iris. You won't be alone anymore. None of you will. I felt bile rise in my throat. Vernon, the missing Vanlifer whose story had circulated through the forums before disappearing. He'd been here. He'd experienced this. And now he was one of them. One of those things standing in the circle around my van. I looked out the window again, searching the figures for anything that might look human, might be Vernon or these others the message mentioned. They all looked the same, tall, wrong, and human. I made a decision born of pure desperation. I was going to run, not in the van. Whatever was keeping vehicles trapped here would probably work on mine, but on foot. I'd take my chances in the forest, try to navigate by starlight, and put as much distance between myself and this clearing as possible. Maybe the effect, whatever it was, had a limited range. Maybe if I could get far enough away, I could find my way back to the main road and flag down help. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan I had. I pulled on my hiking boots, lacing them tight, and put on my heavy jacket. I grabbed my phone, my flashlight, a bottle of water, and my small emergency kit that had a compass, some energy bars, and a basic first aid supplies. I stuffed everything into my jacket pockets, then crept toward the back doors of the van. If I was quiet and fast, maybe I could get into the trees before those things realized I was moving. I put my hand on the door handle and counted to 3 in my head. On 3, I pushed the doors open and jumped out. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled for a second before finding my footing. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, all of them still facing where the van had been, like they hadn't noticed I was gone. The glowing thing in the center of the clearing pulsed brighter for a moment, and I got a better look at it. It was a hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet across, and the light was coming from deep inside it. The edges of the hole were perfectly smooth, too perfect to be natural, and I could see something moving in the depths, shapes that writhed and twisted like worms in a corpse. I looked away before my brain could process what I was seeing and ran toward the tree line, picking the gap between 2 of the figures that seemed widest. I expected them to grab me as I passed, to feel those cold hands like Vernon must have felt, but they remained motionless. I crashed into the underbrush and kept running, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to catch my feet. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, illuminating random patches of forest, a boulder here, a fallen tree there, all of it looking the same and disorienting. I ran for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, my lungs burning from the cold air and exertion. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized I couldn't hear anything behind me. No pursuit, no crashing through the underbrush, no voices calling my name. I leaned against a tree, gasping, and pulled out my phone to check the compass app. The screen lit up, but the compass wasn't working. The needle spun in lazy circles, never settling on a direction. I tried the GPS. Still no signal, still just that blank map with a blue dot. I was about to put the phone away when it buzzed with another message. Running won't help, Iris. But we admire the effort. Most people just freeze. Vernon froze. You're different. That's why we chose you specifically. I felt my legs go weak. They'd chosen me. This wasn't random. Wasn't just bad luck that I'd stumbled onto this cursed clearing. They'd wanted me here specifically. Another message. We've been calling you for weeks. The dreams. You thought they were just dreams. But we were reaching out, pulling you north, guiding you here. You felt it, didn't you? The compulsion to come to Millinocket? I sank down to sit with my back against the tree, my mind reeling. The dreams. I had been dreaming about driving through forests at night, about something in the trees. I'd thought it was just stress, or maybe my subconscious processing the isolation of Vanlife. But what if it had been them, reaching into my sleep somehow, planting the urge to come here? I thought about that clerk at the store, the way he'd warned me about people hearing things in the woods. He'd known, maybe not the specifics, but he'd known something was wrong in these forests. And I'd ignored him, driven right into the trap because some part of me had wanted to come here. My phone buzzed again. Come back to the clearing, Iris. Fighting only makes the transition harder. Vernon fought for 3 days. He barely remembers being human now. But you're stronger. You could keep more of yourself if you just accepted. 3 days. Vernon had lasted 3 days before whatever happened to him was complete. I looked at my phone's clock. It wasn't even 3 a.m. yet. I had hours until dawn, and dawn might not even help. I stood up on shaky legs and started walking again, no longer running, but moving steadily in what I hoped was a direction away from the clearing. My flashlight battery was getting low, the beam growing dimmer, and I switched it off to conserve power. The starlight filtering through the bare branches was just enough to see by, though everything looked flat and colorless. I walked for another 20 minutes, and then I saw something that made my heart sink. The painted stones. The same ones that had been arranged around the clearing, forming that protective or imprisoning circle. I'd come in a complete loop somehow, navigating right back to where I'd started. But that wasn't possible. I'd been walking in a straight line, or as straight as I could manage through dense forest. I looked around wildly and realized the stones extended in both directions, forming a ring much larger than I'd thought. The clearing wasn't the boundary. The entire area, probably several acres, was enclosed by these marked stones, and I was trapped inside it with whatever those things were. A message came through on my phone, and I knew what it would say before I even looked. Welcome back, Iris. Now stop running. It's time to join the circle. I dropped to my knees in front of one of the painted stones, my hands clawing at the frozen ground around it. If the stones were the boundary, maybe I could break through by removing one, disrupting whatever spell or force was keeping me trapped here. My fingers scraped against dirt and roots, nails breaking as I tried to pry the stone loose. It wouldn't budge. It was like the thing was embedded in bedrock, or maybe it wasn't even physically there at all. Maybe it was just a marker for something deeper, something I couldn't touch or move. I sat back on my heels, breathing hard, and felt despair washing over me like a wave. I was going to die here. Or worse, I was going to become like Vernon, like those figures standing around the clearing. I'd lose myself piece by piece until nothing human remained, just a shell that looked almost right but was fundamentally wrong. My phone buzzed, and I almost didn't look at it. But curiosity, that same morbid fascination that had made me pull back the curtain, made me check. The message read, "The stones have been here for 200 years. A trapper put them down after his family disappeared in these woods. He thought they would protect other travelers. He was wrong. They just mark the territory now. Help us remember where we can hunt." 200 years. This thing, whatever it was, had been here for centuries, claiming people, transforming them, building its collection of almost human figures. I thought about all the missing persons cases in Maine, all the hikers and campers who vanished without a trace in the vast forests. How many of them had ended up here? How many were standing in that clearing right now, or wandering these woods as something other than what they'd been? I pulled up my text messages to Colin, my brother, even though I knew they wouldn't send. I typed anyway. Colin, I'm in trouble. Near Millinocket, old logging roads. Something wrong here. If you get this, don't come looking. Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Tell them I'm sorry I left. I hit send and watched the message fail, just like I knew it would. But I tried again and again, hoping that maybe one would slip through whatever barrier was keeping signals from getting out. On the 7th try, something different happened. The message didn't fail immediately. It showed the sending animation for a few seconds, that little circle spinning, before finally giving me the error. But those few seconds meant something. Maybe the barrier wasn't perfect. Maybe if I could find the right spot, the right moment, I could get a message through. I stood up and started walking along the line of stones, testing my phone's signal every 20 feet. Still nothing, just that blank no service indicator. But I kept trying, kept moving, because it was better than sitting still and waiting for whatever came next. I must have walked for an hour, following the curve of the stone circle, and I started recognizing landmarks. A distinctive split pine tree, a boulder shaped like a face, the same backpack I'd seen hanging from a branch on the road end. I'd completed almost the entire circuit and was back near where I'd started. My phone battery was down to 15%. Dawn had to be coming soon, though the darkness didn't seem to be lifting at all. I checked the time, 4:38 a.m. In November in Maine, sunrise should be around 6:30. Less than 2 hours. I just had to survive less than 2 hours, and maybe the daylight would change things, break whatever power this place had. My phone buzzed, and I was so startled I nearly dropped it. Another message. Dawn won't save you, Iris. It never does. The sun rises, the sun sets, and we remain. Always. I felt tears on my cheeks, cold tracks in the freezing air, and I wiped them away angrily. I wasn't going to give up. I'd spent years helping people who'd lost hope, who thought their situations were impossible. I'd talked down suicide attempts, calmed violent episodes, sat with people in their darkest moments, and helped them find a reason to keep going. I could do the same for myself. I pulled out my emergency kit and found the compass, the old-fashioned kind with the actual needle floating in liquid. It was spinning just like the digital one, never settling, but as I watched it I noticed something. Every few rotations, it would slow down slightly when pointing toward one particular direction. Not true north, I could tell that from the stars, but some other direction that seemed to have meaning here. I decided to follow it. What did I have to lose? I walked in the direction the compass indicated, moving through the trees, and after about 10 minutes I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Another circle of posts, like the ones Vernon must have found, but smaller. Only 6 posts instead of a dozen, and these weren't carved with symbols. They were burned, blackened by fire, with chunks of melted metal embedded in them. I approached carefully, my flashlight beam revealing more details. The metal pieces were padlocks, dozens of them, all melted and fused to the wooden posts. Someone had locked these posts, tried to seal whatever this circle contained, and then burned it all. But the posts still stood, and inside the circle the ground was scorched and dead. Nothing grew there, not even weeds or moss. I walked around the perimeter, not daring to step inside after what happened to Vernon, and noticed something scratched into one of the posts. Names. At least 50 names carved into the blackened wood, some so weathered I could barely read them. I recognized one, Marcus Chun, 2019. Another, Sarah Delgado, 2021. And near the bottom, fresher than the others, Vernon Halstead, 2024. My hand shook as I traced the letters of Vernon's name. He'd made it this far, found this place, carved his name like a desperate memorial. And then they'd taken him anyway. I pulled out my keys and started carving my own name below his. Iris Kenmore, 2024. If I didn't make it out, at least there'd be a record I was here, that I'd fought back. I was halfway through carving the last letter when I heard something that made me freeze. Singing. That same melody from earlier, but now there were multiple voices, harmonizing in that strange language. They were coming from the direction of the clearing, getting closer. I shoved my keys back in my pocket and looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. There was a dense thicket of undergrowth about 30 feet away, and I ran for it, diving into the thorny bushes and pulling my jacket up to protect my face. I huddled there, trying to control my breathing, as the singing got louder. Then I saw them, the figures from the clearing, all of them, moving through the forest in a procession. They walked in single file, swaying slightly as they sang, heading toward the burned circle of posts. They weren't searching for me. They seemed to have a purpose, a destination. I counted them as they passed. 37 figures, all impossibly tall and wrong, all moving with that same unnatural grace. The last one in line was different from the others. It was shorter, more human proportioned, and it moved with a jerky, hesitant gait like it was still learning how to walk. I caught a glimpse of its face in my flashlight beam before I could kill the light, and I wished I hadn't. It was Vernon, or what was left of him. His features were still recognizable, the shape of his jaw, the line of his nose, but his eyes were empty and his skin had taken on a gray, waxy quality. His mouth moved with the singing, but the sound that came out was wrong, off-key, like he couldn't quite remember how human voices worked. The procession reached the burned circle and the figures arranged themselves around it, still singing. The one that had been Vernon stood at the edge, staring down at his own name carved into the post. He reached out a hand, too long, with too many joints in the fingers, and touched the letters. The singing stopped, and in the sudden silence I heard him speak. His voice was raspy and fractured, words coming out in broken pieces. I remember writing that. I remember being him. The other figures turned toward him, all those smooth, featureless faces angling in his direction. One of them, the tallest, stepped forward and placed a hand on Vernon's shoulder. You are not him anymore. You are us. You are home. Vernon's head tilted at an angle no human neck should allow, and he made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been sobbing. Home, he repeated. Yes, home. Then all of them, Vernon included, turned to face the thicket where I was hiding. The tall one spoke again, and this time the voice was unmistakably directed at me. Iris, we know you're there. We can smell your fear, taste your despair. Come out. It's time to join the family. I stayed frozen in the bushes, thorns digging into my skin, praying they couldn't actually see me and were just guessing. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket, so loud in the silence that it might as well have been a siren. I fumbled for it, trying to silence it, and saw a notification on the screen. Not a message this time. A call. From Colin. My brother was calling me, which meant my phone had signal, which meant I was outside the barrier or the barrier had dropped. I didn't think. I just answered, pressing the phone to my ear with shaking hands. Colin. My voice came out as a whisper. His voice on the other end was frantic. Iris. Jesus, I've been trying to reach you for hours. Your location popped up on Find My Friends and then disappeared. Where are you? What's happening? The figures in the circle all took a step toward me in unison. I could see them now through the branches, could see Vernon's twisted face at the front of the group. Colin, listen to me, I said quickly. I'm near Millinocket, on an old logging road. Don't come looking for me. Call the police, tell them. The line went dead. I looked at my phone. No service again. But Colin had heard me. He knew where I was. He'd get help. I just had to survive long enough for help to arrive. I crashed out of the thicket and ran, not caring about noise anymore, just focusing on speed and distance. Behind me, I heard the figures following, not running but moving fast in that gliding way they had. I didn't look back. I just ran, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me, my lungs burning. My flashlight battery died and I dropped it, relying on starlight and instinct. I had no plan, no destination, just pure animal panic driving me forward. And then suddenly I broke through the tree line and found myself on a road. Not the logging road I'd driven in on. This was paved, with faded yellow lines down the middle. A real road. I'd made it out. The stone circle must not extend this far, or maybe answering Colin's call had broken something. I didn't care. I just ran down the middle of the road, screaming for help, praying someone would drive by. Behind me, at the edge of the trees, the figures stood in a line, watching, not following onto the paved road. Vernon was at the front, and as I ran I heard his broken voice calling after me. You'll come back. They always come back. The forest calls them home. I kept running until I saw headlights in the distance, until I heard a truck's engine, until salvation came in the form of an elderly couple who stopped and wrapped me in blankets and called 911. I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for hypothermia and exhaustion. The police searched the logging roads, but never found my van or the clearing I described. They said I must have been confused, disoriented. That trauma and cold can make people remember things that didn't happen. Colin believes me though. He drove up from Portland and sat with me while I gave my statement, held my hand while I described Vernon and the others and that glowing hole in the ground. He's researching now, looking through historical records for mentions of disappearances near Millinocket, trying to find the trapper who put down those stones 200 years ago. Sometimes late at night my phone buzzes with messages from that string of zeros. They're always the same. Come home, Iris. We're waiting. We're always waiting. I don't respond. I've moved back in with my parents temporarily, stopped doing van life completely. But the dreams have started again. Different this time. Now I dream I'm standing in that circle with Vernon and the others, singing in that strange language, and part of me, a part one don't want to acknowledge, understands the words, understands what they're calling for. And that terrifies me more than anything that happened in those woods. Because the message said people always come back. And I'm starting to feel the pull, starting to wonder what it would be like to stop fighting, to go home to the place that's calling me. I haven't told Colin about the dreams yet. I don't know if I will. Some things are too horrifying to share, even with family, especially when you're scared they might be true. My name is Garrett Munoz. I'm 52 years old, and I live in Bangor, Maine. I've been driving trucks for 28 years, long haul mostly, coast to coast, the kind of routes that keep you away from home for weeks at a time. My wife, Linda, she got tired of it after 15 years of marriage. Came home one day to divorce papers on the kitchen table and a note that said she'd moved to Florida with some guy she met at her book club. Can't say I blame her really. Hard to maintain a relationship when you're only home 4 days a month. My kids were grown by then anyway. My daughter Amy's a teacher in Boston. My son Derek works in IT somewhere in California. We talk on holidays, birthdays, that kind of thing. Good kids, both of them. After the divorce, I sold the house, put most of my stuff in storage, and bought a used Airstream trailer. Figured if I was going to be on the road all the time anyway, might as well make it official. I'd park the Airstream at truck stops or campgrounds between hauls, and it worked out fine for a couple years. But last month I took early retirement. 62 felt too young to quit, but my back was shot, my knees were worse, and the company was pushing hard for younger drivers who'd work for less. They offered a decent buyout package, and I took it. First time in 3 decades, I didn't have a schedule, didn't have a dispatcher calling me at 5 a.m. with a new route. It felt wrong, honestly. Too much empty time, too much silence. So I started exploring Maine in my truck, not the big rig anymore, just my personal F-250 with the Airstream hitched behind it. I'd pick a direction and drive, find quiet spots to camp, try to figure out what the hell retired people do with themselves all day. That's how I ended up hearing about the old fire tower outside Millinocket. I was at a diner in Lincoln, eating breakfast and listening to a couple of local guys talk about hunting season. One of them mentioned the tower, said it had been abandoned since the 70s, but was still standing. Great views if you were willing to make the hike. The other guy laughed and said nobody went up there anymore, not since people started reporting weird things. I should have asked what kind of weird things, but I was already paying my check and heading out. I'd always liked fire towers, visited a few over the years between truck runs, climbed up and sat in the little observation rooms imagining what it must have been like to work one of those jobs. Just you in the forest, watching for smoke, completely alone for months at a time. Sounded peaceful. I pulled up directions on my phone and saw the access road was only about 40 minutes from where I was. The Airstream could handle rough roads well enough, and I had nothing but time. So I drove out there, following increasingly narrow paths until I found a spot to park near what looked like an old logging road. There was a weathered sign pointing into the woods, Fire Tower 2.1 miles. I grabbed my pack, loaded it with water and snacks, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown but still visible, winding through dense pine forest that smelled like earth and decay. About halfway to the tower, I passed a campsite that had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Tent still standing but torn, sleeping bag half out of it, food scattered around that animals had gotten into. A coffee pot sat on cold ashes in the fire pit. I stood there looking at the scene, feeling uneasy for reasons I couldn't quite name. People leave campsites all the time. Emergencies happen, weather turns bad, whatever. But something about this felt off. The way the sleeping bag was positioned, like someone had been dragged out of it. The scattered food that looked intentionally thrown rather than scattered by animals. And strangest of all, there were scratch marks on the trees surrounding the campsite, deep gouges in the bark that went up maybe 8 or 9 feet high. Way too high for a person to reach, and the wrong pattern for a bear. I took a few pictures with my phone, no service out here of course, and kept walking. The fire tower came into view about 20 minutes later, rising above the canopy like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. It was a standard design, maybe 60 feet tall, made of steel framework painted rust red that had faded to a dull brown. The observation cabin at the top still had windows, though most of them were broken. A metal staircase zigzagged up the outside of the tower, and I could see it was missing railings in several places. I should have turned around right then. The tower was clearly unsafe, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere with nobody knowing where I was. But I'd driven all the way out here, hiked 2 miles, and damn it, I wanted to see the view from the top. I tested the first few stairs, bouncing on them to check stability. They seemed solid enough. I started climbing, taking it slow, keeping one hand on the remaining railing where it existed. The stairs creaked and groaned under my weight, and once I felt a bolt shift under my boot, but everything held. At about the 40-foot mark, I stopped to catch my breath and looked out over the forest. The view was incredible, just endless trees stretching in every direction, broken only by the occasional gleam of a lake or stream. No roads visible, no buildings, no sign of human presence except the tower I was standing on. I could see why fire spotters liked these jobs. You really were alone up here, separate from the world. I continued climbing and reached the observation cabin, pulling myself up through the open trapdoor in the floor. The cabin was a mess. Broken glass everywhere, old papers scattered around, graffiti on the walls, the usual vandalism you'd expect in an abandoned place. But there was also something else. Someone had been living here recently. There was a newer sleeping bag rolled up in the corner, some canned food stacked neatly on a shelf, a battery-powered lantern that still worked when I tested it. And on the walls, covering the graffiti, someone had written hundreds of tally marks. Not in groups of 5 like you'd normally see. These were just individual marks, covering every available surface. Thousands of them. I walked around the small cabin counting sections of wall. In one corner, I found writing mixed in with the tally marks. Day 47, still can't leave. They watch during the day. They come close at night. I count to stay sane. I count to remember I'm human. I felt my skin prickle. Day 47. Someone had been trapped up here for 47 days. I checked the date on the writing. December 2023, almost a year ago. I looked out the broken windows at the forest below, suddenly feeling very exposed, and that's when I noticed the smell. Something dead was nearby, something big enough that the stench had reached up here, even with the wind. I leaned out one of the broken windows, trying to locate the source of the smell, and spotted it maybe 30 feet from the base of the tower. A deer carcass, or what was left of it. But it wasn't just dead, it had been arranged. The bones were laid out in a perfect circle, the skull positioned in the center facing the tower, and the ribs had been broken outward like the petals of some grotesque flower. No animal does that. Animals scatter remains, drag pieces away to eat in privacy. This was deliberate, purposeful, meant to be seen. I backed away from the window and checked my phone out of habit. Still no service, battery at 54%. It was just past 2 p.m. I'd planned to spend an hour or so up here, then hike back to my truck before dark. That plan suddenly seemed very smart. I took one last look around the cabin, photographing the tally marks and the writing, then headed for the trapdoor. That's when I noticed something I'd missed on the way up. Scratched into the metal frame of the door, almost too faint to see, were words, "Don't come down after dark." They weighed at the bottom. I climbed down faster than was probably safe, my boots clanging on the metal stairs, one hand gripping whatever railing existed. The tower swayed slightly in the wind, making my stomach lurch, but I kept moving. I was maybe 20 feet from the ground when I heard it, singing. The same kind of melody I'd heard about in the Vanlife forums, in the stories other people told about Millinocket. High and clear and wrong, drifting through the trees from multiple directions at once. I froze on the stairs, my heart hammering, and looked around. The forest looked normal. Trees, undergrowth, fallen logs, the scattered deer bones. Nothing moving. But the singing continued, circling around the tower, and I realized with growing horror that it was getting closer. I scrambled down the last section of stairs and hit the ground running, not caring about the trail anymore, just crashing through the woods in what I hoped was the direction of my truck. Branches whipped my face and roots tried to trip me, but I kept moving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The singing followed me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside me just out of sight. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, tall shapes keeping pace through the trees, but when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. My truck driving instincts kicked in, the same ones that had kept me alert during overnight hauls through dangerous areas. Don't panic. Keep moving. Find your route. I pulled out my phone and checked the compass app, not expecting it to work, but needing something, anything. Surprisingly, it did work. The needle pointed steadily in one direction, and I followed it, praying it was leading me toward the logging road and not deeper into the forest. After what felt like an hour but was probably 15 minutes, I broke through the trees and saw my F-250 with the Airstream attached. I'd never been so happy to see that beat-up truck in my life. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before getting the door unlocked. I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors, then sat there gasping for breath and checking my mirrors. The forest behind me looked empty, peaceful, exactly like it had when I'd arrived. No singing, no movement, no tall shapes in the shadows. Just trees and afternoon sunlight filtering through the branches. I started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I was losing it. Too much time alone, too much stress from the retirement transition, and my brain was filling in threats that didn't exist. That's what I told myself anyway. But I couldn't explain the arranged deer bones, or the writing in the tower cabin, or that abandoned campsite. Those were real. I'd taken pictures. I pulled out my phone to look at them and felt my stomach drop. The photos were corrupted. Every single one of them showed nothing but static and distorted shapes, like they'd been taken through a broken camera. But my phone had been working fine. I'd used it just an hour ago to navigate. I tried taking a new picture, pointing the camera at my dashboard. The image came out perfect, crystal clear. Whatever had corrupted those photos had done it selectively. I started the engine, determined to get out of there and back to civilization where things made sense. The truck turned over fine, but when I put it in drive and pressed the gas, nothing happened. The engine revved, the RPMs climbed, but the truck didn't move. I checked the parking brake, off. Checked the transmission, in drive, just like it should be. Gave it more gas and felt the whole vehicle shudder, but still no movement. It was like something was holding the truck in place. I shifted to reverse, thinking maybe I'd high-centered on a rock or root. Same problem. The engine worked, everything sounded normal, but the truck wouldn't budge. I sat there staring at the steering wheel, trying to think rationally. This was a mechanical problem. Had to be. Maybe the emergency brake cable had seized, or something was wrong with the transmission, or the Airstream's hitch had locked up somehow. I'd been driving for 3 decades. I knew trucks, knew how to diagnose problems. I could figure this out. I turned off the engine and got out, leaving the keys in the ignition in case I needed to make a quick escape. I walked around the truck checking the wheels. They spun freely when I kicked them, no signs of being locked. I checked under the chassis for obstacles. Nothing. The Airstream looked fine, sitting level on its wheels with no visible problems. I was crouched down looking at the hitch connection when I heard footsteps. Not running this time, just walking. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the undergrowth. I stood up fast, my back protesting, and scanned the tree line. A figure was standing there, maybe 40 feet away, watching me. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and stood perfectly still with its arms at its sides. The afternoon sun was behind it, putting its face in shadow, so I couldn't make out details. But the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, reaching past where the knees should be, and the head was too narrow, almost oval-shaped. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. "I'm having truck trouble. You know anything about mechanics?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there like a statue. I took a step toward it, squinting against the sunlight, trying to see better. I said, "Do you know anything about?" The figure tilted its head at an angle that made my stomach turn. No human neck bends that far. Then it took a step forward, and I could see its legs didn't bend at the knee like they should. Each step was wrong, mechanical, like watching a mannequin try to walk. I backed toward my truck, not taking my eyes off the figure, and bumped into something solid. I spun around, and there was another one, standing right behind me, close enough that I could have touched it if I'd reached out. This close, I could see it clearly. The skin was smooth and gray, almost like clay, and the face had features that were almost human but not quite right. Eyes too far apart, mouth too wide, nose just a suggestion rather than an actual structure. It leaned down toward me, that too wide mouth opening slightly, and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through a cave. "Your truck is fine, Garrett. We're just keeping it here. Keeping you here. You're going to help us understand something." I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and landed hard on the ground. The two figures stood on either side of me now, both leaning down to look at me with those wrongly spaced eyes. The second one spoke, its voice higher but just as hollow, the man in the tower. He lasted 47 days before he understood, before he became like us. "How long will you last?" Garrett Munoz from Bangor. "How long before you stop fighting?" I scrambled backward on my hands and feet like a crab, trying to put distance between myself and those things, until my back hit the side of my truck. They didn't follow, just stood there watching me with those terrible eyes, heads tilted at impossible angles. I pulled myself up using the door handle and yanked the door open, diving inside and slamming it shut. My hands found the lock button and I hammered it repeatedly, even though the doors were already locked. The two figures remained where they were, not approaching, just observing. I cranked the engine again, praying it would somehow work this time, that whatever was holding the truck would let go. The engine roared to life. I threw it in drive and floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward maybe 6 inches before jerking to a stop, so violently I hit my chest against the steering wheel. It felt like I'd driven into an invisible wall. I tried reverse. Same thing. 6 inches of movement. Then that sudden jarring stop. The figures still hadn't moved, but now there were more of them. 5, 6, 7 emerging from the tree line to form a loose semicircle around my truck. I honked the horn, long and loud, hoping the noise would scare them off or attract someone who might help. The sound echoed through the forest. Birds took flight from nearby trees, and the figures didn't even flinch. They just stood there in their eerie stillness, watching. One of them, the first one I'd seen, took a step closer to my driver's side window. When it spoke, I could hear it clearly through the glass. "We don't want to hurt you, Garrett. We never want to hurt anyone. We just want company. We've been alone in these woods for so long, and every few years someone comes, and for a little while we're not alone anymore." The man in the tower, he was good company. He talked to us, told us about his life, his family. Then he stopped talking, stopped being separate, became part of us. You'll do the same, eventually. They all do. I stared at that thing through my window, my mind racing. This was insane. This couldn't be happening. But it was happening, and I needed to think, needed to find a way out. I'd survived 3 decades of long-haul trucking, dealt with breakdowns in bad neighborhoods, aggressive drivers, ice storms that shut down highways. I could survive this. I reached for my phone and tried calling 911. No service. Tried texting Derek, my son. Message failed. I opened my Maps app and watched it search endlessly for a signal. Nothing. Whatever was keeping my truck here was also blocking communications. I checked my food and water supplies. I had maybe 3 days worth in the truck, another week's worth in the Airstream if I rationed carefully. The Airstream. I'd been so focused on the truck I'd forgotten about the trailer. If I could get inside it, lock the door, maybe I'd have better protection than sitting in the cab. The figures were all in front of the truck now, none behind it near the trailer. I made a decision. I unlocked the driver's door, counted to 3, then exploded out of it and ran for the Airstream. I heard that hollow wind voice calling behind me. "Running won't help, Garrett. You're already caught." But I didn't stop. I reached the trailer door, fumbled with the latch, got it open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door and engaged all 3 locks, handle lock, deadbolt, and chain. Then I backed away from the door and stood in the middle of my small living space, breathing hard. The Airstream was dark inside, curtains drawn over all the windows from when I'd last camped. I didn't turn on any lights. Instead, I moved to the front window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. The figures had moved. They were arranged in a circle around both my truck and the trailer now, maybe 15 feet away, all facing inward, all watching. I counted them, 11 in total. Where had the other 4 come from? I hadn't seen them arrive. They'd just appeared, like they'd been there all along, and I simply hadn't noticed. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I jumped, nearly dropping it. I had a notification. A text message from an unknown number. Day 1. Just those 2 words. Nothing else. I stared at the message, feeling sick. They were counting how long I'd last before I became like them. Like that poor bastard in the fire tower who'd made it to day 47. I wasn't going to make it that long. I had maybe 10 days of food and water if I was careful. After that, I'd have to come out, have to face whatever they had planned. I sank down onto my small couch and tried to think strategically. The figures hadn't tried to break in yet, which meant they either couldn't or they were choosing not to. The fact that they were choosing not to was somehow worse. It meant they were patient, willing to wait me out. They had time. They'd been here for years, decades, maybe longer. What were a few days to things like that? I looked around my trailer at my meager possessions. Some clothes, books, a laptop that was useless without internet, camping gear, basic tools. Nothing that would help me fight off supernatural entities or break whatever invisible barrier was keeping my truck trapped. I was a retired truck driver, not a soldier or a survivalist. I didn't have weapons or tactical training. I had a tire iron under my seat and a pocket knife on my keychain. That's it. My phone buzzed again. Another message. The man in the tower tried to leave on day 12. We let him walk for 3 hours before he found himself back at the tower. The forest loops. You'll see. Everyone tries to leave eventually. I thought about that abandoned campsite I'd passed on the way to the tower, the sleeping bag that looked like someone had been dragged from it. Had that person tried to run? How far had they gotten before these things caught them? And what had happened to them after? Were they one of the figures standing outside my trailer right now, transformed into something inhuman, all memories of their old life fading until nothing remained? I shuddered and pulled a blanket around my shoulders. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, probably down into the 40s tonight. The Airstream had a small propane heater, but I need to conserve fuel if I was going to be here for days. I set it to the minimum temperature that would keep me from freezing and settled in for a long night. Through the windows, I could see the figures hadn't moved. They just stood there in their circle, patient as stones, waiting. Around 7 p.m., as the last light was fading from the sky, they started humming. Not singing this time, just a low droning hum that all of them produced in perfect unison. The sound was deep enough that I could feel it vibrating through the floor of the trailer, rattling the dishes in my small sink. The humming continued for hours, never varying in pitch or volume. I tried covering my ears, tried playing music from my phone to drown it out, but nothing helped. The sound was everywhere, inside my head, resonating in my bones. Around midnight, I must have dozed off despite the noise, because I woke up suddenly to silence. The humming had stopped. I looked out the window and saw that the figures had rearranged themselves. They were no longer standing in a circle. Now they were in a line, all facing the same direction, toward the fire tower. I watched them for several minutes, but they didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there facing the tower like they were waiting for something. Then, in the distance, I saw a light. A flickering orange glow coming from the observation cabin at the top of the tower. Someone had lit a fire up there, or turned on a lantern, or I thought about the tally marks on the walls, the writing that said, Day 47, and my blood went cold. What if that person was still up there? What if they'd never left, never escaped, and they'd been trapped in that cabin for almost a year now, slowly transforming into one of these things? The light flickered and moved, and I could swear I saw a silhouette in the window. A human silhouette, or something close to it. I pressed my face against the window, straining to see the figure in the tower more clearly. The light up there moved again, passing from one window to another, and I caught a better glimpse. It was definitely humanoid, but the movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by strings. The figures standing outside my trailer all raised their arms in unison, pointing toward the tower, and began that hollow wind voice speaking in synchronization. Brother, sister, come down. Join us. It's time. The light in the tower flickered more frantically, and I heard something that made my chest tighten, screaming. Distant and muffled by the miles between us, but unmistakably human. Someone was up there, someone who was still human enough to scream. The sound cut off abruptly, and the light went out. The figures lowered their arms and turned back to face my trailer, their eyeless gazes boring into me through the metal walls. One of them spoke, the voice somehow coming from all of them at once. Day 47 ended tonight. Tomorrow, day 48 begins. But not for him. For you, Garrett. Day 2 starts at sunrise. I backed away from the window, and sat down hard on my couch, my mind reeling. Someone had been in that tower for 47 days, fighting against whatever these things were, and tonight they'd lost. Tonight they'd become one of those figures, which meant there were now 12 of them instead of 11. I checked my phone, 2:34 a.m., battery at 31%. I put it on airplane mode to conserve power and tried to think. I had maybe 8 more days before I ran out of food and water. 8 days to find a way out of this, or I'd end up like the person in the tower. I couldn't let that happen. My kids needed me, even if we only talked on holidays. My ex-wife might not care, but Amy and Derek would wonder what happened to their old man. I had to survive this. I had to get out. I spent the rest of the night going through everything in my trailer, taking inventory and looking for anything useful. I found my toolbox under the bed, screwdrivers, wrenches, a small hacksaw, duct tape, zip ties. I found emergency flares in the storage compartment. I found a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the cabinet above the sink. Not much, but it was something. As dawn broke, gray light filtering through the curtains, I heard the figures moving outside. Their footsteps made no sound, but I could see their shadows passing the windows. They were circling the trailer around and around, faster than before. The circle tightened until they were close enough that I could have touched them through the windows if I'd opened the curtains fully. Then they stopped, all at once, and the newest voice spoke. It was more human than the others, still rough and broken, but recognizable as someone who'd been a person recently. I remember. Saw you, climbing the tower. Watched you leave. Thought you'd escape. But nobody escapes. I didn't. You won't. It was the person from the tower, the one who'd lasted 47 days. They were one of these things now, and they were right outside my trailer talking to me. I wanted to ask them questions. Who were you? How did this happen? Is there any way to reverse it? But I was too scared to respond. Engaging with them felt dangerous, like it would give them some kind of power over me. My phone buzzed. Another message. Day 2. The man in the tower stopped eating on day 15. Stopped drinking on day 23. His body forgot it needed those things. But he kept breathing, kept thinking, kept counting. Will you count, Garrett? Will you make tally marks on your walls to remember you're human? I looked at the metal walls of my Airstream, imagining them covered in scratches like the tower cabin. How many days would pass before I started doing that? Before the isolation and fear broke my mind enough that keeping track of time became the only thing that mattered? I shook my head violently, trying to clear those thoughts. I wasn't going to let it get that far. I'd find a way out. I had to. I opened my laptop and started typing, documenting everything that had happened. If I didn't make it, maybe someone would find this eventually. Maybe it would help the next person who got trapped here. I typed for hours, recording every detail I could remember, until my laptop battery died and I had to stop. Around noon, I forced myself to eat something, a granola bar and some water. My stomach was in knots and I didn't want food, but I needed to keep my strength up. The figures outside had gone still again, standing in their circle, facing inward. Watching, waiting. I tried the engine one more time, just to see if anything had changed. Nothing. The truck started fine, but wouldn't move. I turned it off to save gas and went back into the trailer. The day dragged on forever. I tried to read, tried to sleep, tried to do anything to distract myself from the figures outside. But my eyes kept going to the windows, checking to make sure they were still there, making sure they hadn't gotten closer. Around 4 p.m. something changed. I heard an engine in the distance, getting closer. A vehicle was coming down the logging road. Hope surged through me. Someone else was here, someone who might have a phone that worked or could help me somehow. I ran to the front window and saw headlights through the trees. An old pickup truck, maybe 1980s vintage, emerged from the forest and pulled up next to mine. The driver was a woman, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. She got out of her truck and looked around, seemingly unbothered by the figures standing in their circle. She walked right past them like they weren't there, came up to my trailer, and knocked on the door. "Hey there," she called out. "Saw your truck from the main road. You having trouble?" I stared at her through the window, my brain struggling to process this. She couldn't see them. The figures were standing right there, close enough to touch, and she was acting like the clearing was empty. "Ma'am," I called through the door, not opening it. "Can you see anything unusual around here? Anything standing near my truck?" She looked around, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Just trees and your rig." "Why? What am I supposed to be seeing?" The figures all turned to look at her, their heads swiveling in that wrong way. The newest one, the person from the tower, moved closer to her, close enough that they were inches apart. The woman didn't react, didn't see it. "Ma'am, I think you should leave. Right now. Get back in your truck and drive away as fast as you can." She frowned at me through the window. "You okay in there, buddy? You sound pretty worked up. I can call someone if you need help. Got my phone right here." She pulled out her phone and I saw it clearly. Full signal bars. 4 bars of perfect service. "Wait," I shouted. "Can you call 911? Tell them someone's trapped out here, needs immediate assistance." She looked at me strangely but nodded, dialing the number. I watched her face as she talked to the dispatcher, giving them the location, describing my situation. She lowered the phone and called out, "They're sending someone, but it'll be at least an hour. Forest Service has to come from Millinocket. You sure you don't want to just drive out of here with me? I got tow straps if your truck's stuck." I wanted to say yes so badly it hurt, but I knew what would happen if I opened that door. The figures would come in, or they'd grab me, or something worse. "I can't leave the trailer," I said. "Please, just wait with me until help arrives." She shrugged, leaning against her truck. "Sure thing. Name's Margaret, by the way." The figures began moving toward her, all 12 of them, closing in slowly. She still didn't see them, didn't react as they formed a tight circle around her. I pressed my hands against the window, wanting to warn her, but knowing it wouldn't help. She couldn't see them. Whatever these things were, they existed on some level that most people couldn't perceive. The newest figure, the one from the tower, reached out and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. She shivered slightly and rubbed her arms. "Getting cold," she said, not looking behind her. Weird for this time of day. The figure leaned down close to her ear and spoke, that broken voice somehow carrying to me in the trailer. "You can't help him, Margaret. But you can stay. Stay with us. We've been alone so long." Margaret's expression went blank. Her eyes glazed over, and she stood perfectly still, no longer moving or speaking. The figures all placed their hands on her, covering her with their gray, clay-like skin, and she began to change. I could see it happening even from inside my trailer. Her skin took on that same gray tone. Her proportions started shifting, her joints bending backward. I pounded on the window, screaming at them to stop, but my voice didn't reach her. Within minutes, Margaret was gone. What stood in her place was the 13th figure, tall and wrong and silent. Her truck sat empty beside mine. I collapsed onto the floor of my trailer, my whole body shaking. Margaret had been real, alive, and now she was one of them. Transformed in minutes, everything that made her human stripped away and replaced with that hollow, empty thing. And she'd called 911. Help was coming, or at least she'd said it was. But would they arrive in time? Would they be able to see these things, or would they end up like Margaret, absorbed into this nightmare? I crawled to my small sink and splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm down, trying to think. The figures were now standing in 2 circles, 12 in the outer ring, and Margaret's transformed shape in an inner ring by herself, like she was being initiated. They began humming again, that deep, resonant tone that vibrated through everything, and Margaret's new form swayed in time with the sound. I checked my phone. Still on airplane mode, battery at 19%. It was 4:47 p.m. If help was really coming, they'd be here by 6 p.m. at the latest. I just had to hold out for another hour and change. The humming stopped and the figures dispersed slightly, giving Margaret's shape room to move. She walked in a slow circle, her movements still jerky and uncertain like a newborn learning to walk, and then she approached my trailer. Her face, if you could call it that, was turned toward my window. When she spoke, her voice was already losing its human quality, becoming more like the hollow wind sound of the others. "Garrett, I remember calling for help. I remember wanting to save you. But now I understand. You don't need saving. You need joining. It's peaceful here. No more worry. No more loneliness. Come out, Garrett. Let us show you." I backed away from the window, my heart hammering. They were using her fresh transformation to try to convince me to give up. But I'd seen what they did. I'd watched them strip away everything that made Margaret a person. I wasn't going to let that happen to me. I grabbed my tire iron from under the couch and held it like a weapon, even though I knew it probably wouldn't do any good against things that existed partly outside normal reality. Time crawled. I watched the sun sink lower through my windows, watched the shadows lengthen, watched the figures maintain their patient vigil outside. At 5:30 p.m., I heard another engine. This one was louder, heavier, probably the Forest Service vehicle Margaret had called. I rushed to the window and saw a green truck with official markings pulling into the clearing. 2 rangers got out, a man and a woman, both wearing uniforms and carrying radios. The male ranger approached my trailer while the female one examined my truck. "Hello," the man called out. "We got a call about someone needing assistance out here." I pressed my face against the window. "Yes, I'm stuck, my truck won't move, and I stopped myself. If I told them about the figures, they'd think I was crazy. They probably couldn't see them anyway, just like Margaret hadn't been able to. "There's something wrong with my truck," I finished lamely. "It runs but won't drive, and my phone has no service." The male ranger nodded, pulling out his own phone. "Yeah, service is spotty out here. Let me take a look at your vehicle." He walked over to my F-250, and I watched in horror as he passed within inches of one of the figures. It reached out toward him, but didn't touch him, like it was waiting for permission or the right moment. The female ranger joined him, and they both examined my truck, checking the wheels and undercarriage. They were talking to each other, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. After a few minutes, the male ranger came back to my trailer. "Sir, we can't find anything mechanically wrong with your truck. Have you tried starting it recently?" I nodded frantically. "Yes, over and over. It starts fine, but won't move. Something's holding it here." The ranger gave me a concerned look, the kind I'd seen before on people who were dealing with someone they thought might be mentally unstable. "Okay, sir, why don't you come out, and we'll try starting it together. Sometimes these things just need a fresh set of eyes." I didn't want to leave the trailer, but I also didn't want them to leave me here. If I stayed inside and refused to come out, they'd probably drive away thinking I was some paranoid hermit who didn't actually need help. I took a deep breath and made my decision. "I'm coming out," I called. "Just stay close to me, okay? Don't let me get separated from you." The ranger's concerned expression deepened, but he nodded. "Sure thing, sir. We'll be right here." I unlocked the 3 locks on my door, grabbed my tire iron, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The figures immediately moved closer, tightening their circles. I could see them clearly, all 13 of them, including Margaret's fresh transformation. But the rangers didn't react, didn't see them at all. I stayed close to the male ranger as we walked to my truck. "Keys are in the ignition," I said. "Just try it." He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He put it in drive and pressed the gas, and the truck moved forward smoothly, no resistance at all. I stood there staring as he drove my truck in a small circle, then pulled it back to where it had been parked. He got out smiling. "Seems to be working fine now, sir. Maybe something was just stuck and worked itself loose. You should be good to drive out of here." I shook my head in disbelief. It wasn't working before. I tried dozens of times. Something was holding it here. The female ranger joined us, her expression sympathetic but clearly thinking I was losing it. "Sometimes vehicles act funny in remote areas, sir. Cold affects the mechanics, or you might have been stuck on something without realizing it. Main thing is, you're mobile now. We'd recommend heading back to town before dark though. These old logging roads aren't great to navigate at night." I looked at the figures. They hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the truck working. They just stood there watching with those terrible blank faces. Why had they let the truck go? What had changed? Then I understood. They didn't need to keep me trapped anymore. I'd stayed too long, been exposed to them too long. I was already marked, already changing. That's what the message had said. You can't leave. No one leaves once they've been marked. I turned to the rangers, desperation making my voice shake. "Please, you have to help me. There's something wrong with this place. People disappear here. There was a man in the fire tower and a woman named Margaret who came by earlier, and they're all..." I gestured at the figures, but the rangers just looked at the empty air where I was pointing. The male ranger put a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. "Sir, I think you've been out here alone too long. We see this sometimes with solo campers. The isolation can play tricks on your mind. Why don't you follow us back to Millinocket? We can get you checked out at the clinic, make sure you're okay." I wanted to argue, wanted to make them see what I was seeing, but I knew it was pointless. They couldn't see the figures. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown. And maybe I was. Maybe everything I'd experienced was a hallucination brought on by stress and loneliness. But I didn't think so. I thought it was real, and I thought I was in serious danger. "I'll follow you out," I said finally. "Just Let me get my stuff from the trailer." The rangers nodded and walked back to their vehicle to wait. I returned to my Airstream, grabbed my phone and wallet and the laptop with my documentation, and took one last look around. This had been my home for 2 years, and I might never see it again. I locked the door and walked to my truck, climbing into the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition where the Ranger had left them. I started the engine, put it in drive, and followed the green Forest Service truck out of the clearing. As I drove, I watched the figures in my rearview mirror. They didn't follow. They just stood there in their circles, watching me leave, and I could swear I heard that wind voice in my head. "Day 2 ends. But you'll be back, Garrett. They always come back. The forest calls them home." I followed the Rangers down the logging road, back towards civilization, back towards safety. But I could feel something wrong inside me, something that had changed during those 2 days. My joints ached in strange ways. My skin felt tight and wrong. And in the back of my mind, underneath my conscious thoughts, I could hear humming. We reached the main paved road and the Rangers pulled over, the male one getting out to talk to me. "You good from here, sir? Millinocket is about 20 miles south. There's a motel and a clinic in town." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "If you're having thoughts of hurting yourself or others, we can escort you directly to the hospital. Nobody would think less of you for asking for help." I shook my head. "I'm fine, just tired. Thank you for coming out." He didn't look convinced, but he got back in his truck and they drove away, leaving me alone on the empty road. I sat there for a while, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. I could drive to Millinocket, check myself into the clinic, tell them I'd had some kind of episode. They'd probably keep me for observation, run some tests, maybe prescribe something for anxiety or psychosis. Or I could drive home to Bangor, pretend this never happened, try to go back to my normal retired life. But even as I thought about those options, I knew I wasn't going to take them, because the humming in my head was getting louder and I was starting to understand what it was saying. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Derek, my son, and 2 texts asking if I was okay. He'd tried to reach me during those 2 days when I was trapped. I should call him back, tell him I was fine, but my fingers wouldn't dial. Instead, I found myself opening my messages and looking at those texts from the unknown number. Day 1. Day 2. There was a new one, received just minutes ago. Day 2 ends. Day 3 begins. "You're free to leave, Garrett, but you'll be back. In 3 days, maybe 5. You'll feel the pull. You'll hear us calling, and you'll come home." I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and started driving, not toward Millinocket or Bangor, but south on the empty highway. I drove for hours, putting miles between myself and that cursed forest, trying to outrun whatever was happening to me. But I could feel it growing stronger with each passing mile. The humming in my head, the wrongness in my joints, the way my eyes were starting to see things in the shadows that shouldn't be there. By the time I reached Portland, it was past midnight. I pulled into a rest stop and looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My face looked normal, human, but when I turned my head a certain way, I could see something else underneath, a suggestion of that gray clay texture, those 2 wide eyes. It was starting, the transformation, and I didn't know how to stop it. I picked up my phone and called Derek. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Dad? Jesus, I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. Where are you?" I opened my mouth to tell him everything. The fire tower, the figures, Margaret, the Rangers who couldn't see what I was seeing. But what came out was, "I'm fine, son. Just had some truck trouble in the woods, no cell service. Everything's okay now." There was a pause on the other end. "You sure? You sound off." I forced my voice to sound normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. "Just tired. Long day. Hey, Derek, do me a favor. If I don't check in with you in a week, if you can't reach me, don't come looking. Okay? Promise me." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "Nothing. Just promise me." He agreed reluctantly, and we said our goodbyes. I hung up and sat in the dark parking lot, listening to the humming in my head get louder, knowing that in 3 days, maybe 5, I'd be driving back north. Back to Millinocket. Back to that clearing where 13 figures waited in patient circles. Because they were right. I could feel it now. That pull, that compulsion. The forest was calling me home, and I didn't have the strength to resist forever. None of us did.